Spotting the shallow path across a river sounds simple, right? Just look for where the water looks calm and step in.
So am I.
But for a caveman, this was less Instagram travel hack and more life or death, but also kinda hilarious. Imagine being barefoot, holding a stick you carved 5 minutes ago with a rock, squinting at a river that might be waist deep, or might hide a hole that'll swallow you whole, like nature's prank. That's the scene we're painting here. The first step in any prehistoric river crossing wasn't bravery, it was observation. Cavemen didn't have waterproof boots, GoPros, or even the luxury of yelling yo. Before diving in, they had to read the river. Picture a caveman crouched down, his brow furrowed in intense thought, staring at ripples as if they're secret codes. The logic went something like this. Calmer water might mean shallow ground, while wild swirling currents screamed instant regret, of course. Sometimes calm water also meant quicksand like mud that sucked you down like a Stone Age vacuum cleaner. So yeah, it wasn't an exact science. Now, here's the funny part. Cavemen weren't exactly masters of subtlety. If one guy thought he spotted a shallow path, the rest of the clan just shrugged and followed him like lemmings. If he was wrong, boom 10, wet, angry, hungry humans stumbling out of the river, yelling grunts that roughly translated to, "Nice job, Steve." And if by miracle he was right, they'd crown him the Einstein of the Stone Age, even though his method was literally squinting at the water until his eyes hurt. But observation wasn't enough. Cavemen also carried sticks, long gnarled branches stripped of leaves, not because they wanted to look like Gandalf, but because those sticks worked as prehistoric measuring tapes. The ritual went like this. Poke the riverbed in front of you. Grunt with approval if the stick hit bottom quickly, or grunt in terror if the stick kept sinking with no end in sight. This was the caveman version of a depth chart, though far less accurate and much more comedic when someone miscalculated. Imagine a proud caveman proclaiming, "Safe here," right before vanishing under the water like a dropped sack of potatoes. Luck played a huge role, too. Even with keen eyes and sturdy sticks, rivers were unpredictable. Sometimes the shallow path turned out to be a rock garden slicker than an ice rink. Picture a caveman taking one confident step, then another, then suddenly doing the Stone Age version of figure skating, arms flailing, legs kicking, before landing flat on his back with a splash. The clan watching from shore, half horrified, half entertained. Honestly, river crossing was as much community theater as survival tactic. And let's not forget the animals. Rivers weren't just water. They were prime real estate for fish, frogs, and the occasional, "Oh God, what is that?" lurking under the surface. A caveman stepping into what looked like a shallow pool might get a rude surprise when something scaly brushed his leg. Cue the high-pitched scream that no caveman wanted to admit was his own. Spotting the shallow path wasn't just about finding a way across. It was also about picking the spot least likely to contain bite. Marks as souvenirs, there was also an element of trial and error. If one caveman got soaked, the others took note. They didn't write notes. Of course, they just laughed, pointed, and remembered not to step where he did. This was the Stone Age version of peer-reviewed science. Sacrifice one guy to the river gods, then adjust strategy. The brave or unlucky first crosser was basically the guinea pig, and his dignity was the price of progress. But here's the beauty. Sometimes, just sometimes, they got it right. The water stayed ankle deep, the rocks firm, the current gentle. The whole group shuffled across, triumphant, their laughter echoing over the water. For a moment, they looked like masters of the natural world. Then one guy slipped anyway and reminded everyone that nature always wins. So, spotting the shallow path wasn't just a survival skill. It was a blend of luck, comedy, teamwork, and a whole lot of splashing. It set the tone for the rest of the river crossing adventure. A task that looked serious, felt dangerous, and yet always ended up being the funniest part of the day. Caveman science wasn't about equations or it was about rocks. Big ones, small ones, whatever the riverbank offered. The second phase of crossing a river after squinting at the water like a confused detective was the throw a rock and see what happens method. And yes, it was exactly as ridiculous as it sounds. Picture this, a group of cavemen lined up on the bank, each clutching a stone. They don't know depth charts, they don't know buoyancy. What they do know is gravity. One caveman lobs a rock into the water plunk. If the rock disappears without a trace, the clan groan. Too deep if it makes a loud splash, but they can still see it resting on the bottom. Jackpot. That's the prehistoric equivalent of a green traffic light. Move forward. But of course, the method had flaws. Rocks don't float. A stone that sank quickly could mean shallow ground door. It could mean the start of a sudden drop-off one step later. That didn't stop cavemen from having blind faith in the system. Imagine one guy confidently stepping in where the rock proved it was safe, only to vanish waist deep with a panicked splash. The rest of the clan, laughing so hard they nearly fell on themselves. Caveman science was always peer-reviewed by laughter. The technique wasn't just about depth, it was also about sound. Cavemen believed that the plunk of a stone told you something about the water. A soft, dull sound meant mud. A sharp splash meant rocks. A big, echoing crash. That was the caveman way of saying, nope, not today. It wasn't accurate. But hey, when you're inventing survival techniques on the fly, every sound is a clue. Now, here's where it gets funny. Cavemen weren't picky about their testing materials. Sometimes they threw pebbles. Sometimes boulders. Sometimes, let's be honest, whatever random object they could get their hands on. Like a bone left over from dinner. If you think about it, this was the first ever game of skip stones. Except instead of trying to impress their crush, they were trying not to drown. And there's always that one guy who overdoes it. He spots a giant rock, half sit over his shoulder with pride, and lobs it into the water. The result? A tidal wave that soaks everyone before they've even stepped in. Congratulations, you're wet, and you haven't crossed an inch. The clan now hates you, but at least they know where not to step. But the best part of this ritual was the overconfidence. Cavemen truly believed that if a rock landed safely, then the path was blessed. Cue a line of them, wading in, one after another, with blind optimism. It worked just often enough to keep the tradition alive. And when it didn't, well, the river got its entertainment for the day. You might think this is silly, but honestly, it wasn't too far off from modern logic. Don't we still test things by throwing objects? Checking ice thickness by hurling a stone? Seeing if something is hot by flicking water on it? The caveman rock test was just the ancestor of all our half-baked try-it-and-see experiments, except with much higher stakes and much funnier failures. So yes, the caveman test with rocks was crude. It was inaccurate. It was laughably simple. But it was also genius in its own bumbling way. It turned a deadly unknown into something measurable. And more importantly, it gave the clan a ritual, a process, a moment of shared suspense. Would the rock prove safety or a disaster? Would the brave first step end in triumph for a soggy slapstick routine? Either way, it was entertainment. And in the Stone Age, where Netflix was just staring at fire for hours, this was primetime viewing. Once the caveman had squinted at ripples and lobbed enough rocks to annoy every fish in the river, it was time for the next step, the stick trick. If the river was the boss battle, the stick was their cheat code. A long branch stripped of leaves became the most important tool in prehistoric river crossing history. Forget spears or fire. This was balance, survival, and comedy all rolled into one wooden pole. Imagine a caveman stepping into the water, his hairy feet sinking into cold mud. In one hand, he clutches a stick twice his height, jabbing it ahead like a blind man discovering the world. To him, that stick is part safety net, part magic wand. He leans on it, testing each step, praying he won't suddenly disappear underwater like a dropped chicken leg in soup. The clan watches nervously because if he falls, he's not just wet, he's the day's entertainment. The stick had multiple uses. First, depth detection. Every poke into the riverbed gave a tiny snapshot of what lay ahead. Shallow, good. A sudden nothingness where the stick keeps sinking. Bad. Very bad. That was the prehistoric equivalent of Siri screaming, "Make a U-turn now." Second, the stick was a balance pole. Cavemen weren't exactly known for their coordination. Imagine muscles built for hunting mammoths, not for tiptoeing across slippery rocks. Without the stick, they'd wobble like toddlers on roller skates. With it, they had at least a fighting chance. And here's the kicker. The stick also doubled as a weapon against gravity, against fish, even against each other. Cavemen crossing together often poked each other accidentally, sending someone splashing down while the rest roared with laughter. It wasn't bullying, it was bonding. In the Stone Age, a shove into freezing water was basically a high five. Of course, the stick trick didn't always go smoothly. Sometimes the stick got stuck between rocks. Picture a caveman planting it firmly, only for the current to yank it sideways. He holds on, refusing to let go, while the water drags him around like he's riding a bull. His clan, laughing so hard they nearly choke on their mammoth jerky. Other times, the stick broke mid-crossing snap. Down goes the caveman, arms flailing, legs kicking, stick halves floating away like driftwood trophies. Another failed experiment, another story for the fire circle. And then there were the overconfident sharks. One guy would strut into the river, holding the stick like a knight's lance. pretending he had mastered the art. 2 steps in, he'd plan it wrong, slip, and end up hugging the very stick that betrayed him while his head bobbed above water. Moral of the story: humility wasn't optional, it was enforced by physics. But sometimes the stick trick worked perfectly. Step by careful step, jab by jab, the caveman reached the other side, dry, victorious, and smug. He'd slam the stick into the ground like a trophy, puff out his chest, and grunt as if he'd just invented engineering. And in a way, he had. That simple branch was the first walking stick, the first trekking pole, the first tool that turned a river crossing from chaos into strategy. Think about it. Modern hikers still use sticks. Tightrope walkers still use poles. Even athletes use balance bars. The caveman, in his goofy, clumsy way, stumbled onto a universal truth: if you're going to fight nature, you'd better bring something to lean on. The stick wasn't just survival. It was wisdom carved out of necessity. So, in the grand saga of Stone Age river crossings, the stick trick deserves its own epic ballad. It was awkward. It was messy. It was hilarious. But it worked. And sometimes, that was all that mattered. If sticks were the training wheels of river crossing, logs were the Stone Age equivalent of sports cars. Entered the floating log hack. The caveman's bold, slightly unhinged strategy of dragging a tree trunk into the water and riding it like a prehistoric jet ski. On paper, genius. In practice, absolute chaos. Picture the scene. A group of cavemen heave and grunt, rolling a massive log from the forest to the riverbank. Sweat dripping, backs aching. They finally shove it into the current. It bobs there invitingly, like nature's invitation to disaster. One brave soul straddles it, clinging for dear life, while the clan cheers him on. For a moment he looks majestic, like a primitive king of the river. Then the log shifts, spins, and dumps him headfirst into the icy water. Applause erupts. The river claims another ego. The floating log hack wasn't just about bravado. It was survival creativity. Cavemen didn't invent boats yet, but they knew it floated. That was all the logic they needed. If fish could swim, why couldn't cavemen ride? Never mind balance. Never mind steering. Those were problems for future cavemen. For now, the solution was grab tree, sit, hope, and oh, the comedy it produced. Logs don't have seats. They roll, they spin, they're slippery as wet soap. Imagine a caveman trying to mount one, legs flailing, arms windmilling, face smacking the water with a loud slap. Meanwhile, the log drifts downstream without him, perfectly calm, as if mocking his failure. By the time he scrambles back to shore, the clan is doubled over with laughter, and the log already halfway to the next village. Sometimes the log hack turned into teamwork. Several cavemen would pile onto a single trunk, clinging to each other like terrified toddlers. For the first few seconds, it looked promising. Unity, balance, triumph. Then one sneeze, one wiggle, one mistimed laugh, and the whole group toppled in, arms and legs thrashing, water spraying like a busted fountain. The log once again floated away. The river didn't take prisoners. It just gave out comedy shows. But here's the thing. Every now and then, it actually worked. One caveman, through sheer luck or freakish balance, managed to ride the log across. The clan erupted in cheers, lifting him on their shoulders once he reached the other side. He was a hero, a pioneer, a legend at least until the next guy tried to copy him and ended up coughing up river water for 10 minutes. The floating log hack also had an unintended side effect: wildlife encounters. Logs were fish magnets. Picture a caveman clinging to his makeshift raft, wide-eyed as dozens of fish swarmed beneath him. Or worse, when the log drifted too close to a sunbathing crocodile. Suddenly, the hack became a frantic paddle-for-your-life moment. Logs floated, yes, but they didn't come with safety guarantees. Still, the floating log was revolutionary. It taught cavemen about buoyancy, about the possibility of transport, about dreaming bigger than just wading waist deep. Without logs, maybe boats, rafts, and ships would never have been imagined. The comedy was real, but so was the breakthrough. So when you picture a caveman straddling a giant log, half hero, half clown, remember, he was inventing the future, one splash at a time. Sure, he looked ridiculous. Sure, most attempts ended with coughing, sputtering, and bruised dignity. But once in a while, he glided across like a river god, proving that sometimes stupidity and brilliance float on the same log. If logs were the chaotic gamble, stone steps were the caveman's first taste of engineering. Forget skyscrapers and bridges stacking rocks to cross a river. Was prehistoric architecture at its finest, or at least at its funniest. Picture it. A group of cavemen staring at a shallow stretch of river, arms crossed, grunting in deep discussion. The idea is simple. Grab rocks, pile them in the water, and voila, a path emerges. No map, no blueprints, just sweaty optimism. Each caveman lugs a boulder twice the size of his head, wobbling like he's about to snap in half. He staggers to the edge, drops it in the river with a splash, and grunts with satisfaction as if he's just invented physics. At first, it looks brilliant. A few stones here, a few there, and suddenly the clan has stepping spots to hop across. Spirits are high. They're building. They're solving problems. They're geniuses. But then reality crashes in. One wrong step, and the rock wobbles. Another step, and the carefully balanced pile shifts. Suddenly, the entire bridge collapses like a toddler's Lego tower, leaving one unlucky caveman face first in the water. Cue laughter, cue yelling, cue more rocks thrown not to rebuild, but out of frustration. And let's not forget the slippery factor. Wet stones are basically prehistoric banana peels. Cavemen would hop confidently from one rock to the next, only to skid like cartoon characters, arms flailing in slow motion before plunging into the river. Some landed flat on their backs. Others went down butt first, creating splashes big enough to soak everyone else waiting to cross. The river always had the last laugh. Still, there was genius buried in the chaos. Over time, cavemen learned tricks. Bigger, flatter rocks made better foundations. Smaller stones wedged into gaps stopped the big ones from shifting. Inadvertently, they were inventing stability, learning lessons that would someday lead to real bridges. Every tumble was a lecture from Mother Nature. Every bruise a footnote in the textbook of trial and error engineering. And oh, the teamwork dynamics. One caveman suggested stacking rocks in neat lines. Another argued for random piles. They grunted, they shoved, they gestured wildly, until eventually one guy just tossed a boulder without warning, splashing everyone and ending the debate. Problem solved at least, until the pile collapsed again. Caveman democracy at its finest. Sometimes, the stone step path even worked. Imagine the triumphant moment when the clan finally hops from rock to rock, crossing dry well, mostly dry for the first time. They cheer, they beat their chests, they feel invincible. For once, the river didn't humiliate them. Of course, 2 minutes later, another caveman tries to cross, slips on the same rocks, and reminds everyone that victory is always temporary. Looking back, the stone step method was more than just survival, it was innovation. It was cavemen saying, we can shape the world, not just suffer through it. Sure, it was clumsy. And yes, most of the time, it ended in someone nursing a bruised backside. But in between the laughter and the splashes, the seeds of human engineering were planted quite literally, one rock at a time. So next time you see a neat row of stepping stones across a creek, thank the cavemen. They bled, they slipped, they drowned their pride so that we could one day stroll across with style. And maybe, just maybe, laugh at how much we still slip on wet rocks today. By now, the cavemen had tried squinting at ripples, chucking rocks, wobbling with sticks, riding logs, and stacking stones. Some of those methods worked, sort of. But then came one of their wildest ideas yet. Ropes. Except, of course, they didn't have ropes. They had vines long, twisted strands yanked straight out of the jungle. Enter the caveman rope hack, the Stone Age's first DIY. Imagine a caveman staring at a tree on one bank, then another tree across the river. The gears in his head turn slowly. What if I tie this vine here and then swing across like a very hairy Tarzan? The clan watches, half excited, half convinced they're about to witness natural selection at work. With grunts of effort, they strip vines, knot them badly, and secure one end to a tree trunk. The other end, tossed across the river with hopeful grunts until someone manages to snag a branch on the far side. The bridge is born. The first brave soul steps up, grabbing the vine with both hands. He takes a deep breath, runs a few steps, and swings out over the water. For a brief, glorious moment, he soars. He's flying. He's a Stone Age superhero. And then the vine snaps, sending him plummeting like a sack of rocks into the river. Splash, cheers, laughter, zero, dignity. But failure never stopped cavemen. They tied thicker vines, doubled them up, twisted them tighter. Soon, the vine rope actually held most of the time. Cavemen swung, clung, and even shimmied across hand over hand. It was terrifying, exhausting, and hilarious. Picture 3 cavemen dangling in the middle, all stuck because none of them had the strength to keep going. Meanwhile, the clan on shore is doubled over, howling, pointing, not helping in the slightest sometimes. The vine wasn't used for swinging. but as a lifeline. A caveman would clutch it while stepping into the water, holding on like his life depended on it because it did. The river tugged, the current pulled, but the vine gave him just enough confidence to stumble across. Of course, half the time the vine slipped loose from the tree, and the poor guy floated downstream, clutching his useless rope like a security blanket. And oh, they loved the vine trick. One caveman would grab the rope, scream a victory grunt, and leap like a circus acrobat. For 5 seconds, he'd look incredible, soaring across in a perfect arc. Then, the landing face first in the mud, knees buckling, but in the air. Hero to zero in under 10 seconds. His friends laughed so hard they couldn't breathe. But every disaster had a silver lining. Through trial and error, cavemen discovered real technique. Stronger vines worked. Tighter knots mattered. Supporting the rope at different points made it last longer. In their chaotic, splash-filled experiments, they stumbled on the earliest principles of construction and tension. In other words, every faceplant was a baby step toward inventing bridges and ropes as we know them today. And when it worked, though, it was glorious. The clan whooped and hollered as one of their own swung safely across, dry and triumphant. It wasn't just survival. It was a show, a celebration, a victory against the river. For that moment, the caveman clutching his vine wasn't just crossing water. He was conquering it. So yes, the vine rope hack was ridiculous. It broke. It failed. It humiliated, but it also inspired.
We're gonna die!
Because sometimes the difference between disaster and innovation is just one vine that doesn't snap at last.
What do we do?
After squinting at ripples, lobbing rocks, poking with sticks, wobbling on logs, stacking stones, and swinging on vines, the cavemen reached the final act, celebration. Crossing the river wasn't just about survival anymore. It was a performance. And like every great performance, it ended with laughter, triumph, and at least one spectacular fail. Picture it. A caveman stumbles onto the far bank, dripping wet but alive. He beats his chest, throws his arms in the air, and lets out a victory grunt that echoes through the trees. Behind him, the clan erupts cheers, hoots, sticks banging on rocks. They'd done it. They'd crossed a river without a bridge, without boats, without modern anything. For 5 glorious seconds, they feel like champions of the world. Then it happens. The finale. The river always demanded one last lap. Maybe the hero trips on a route while celebrating. Maybe his foot slips on the muddy bank. Maybe he turns to gloat at his friends and splatlands flat on his back, covered in muck. Pride shattered in an instant. The clan howls with laughter, some falling to their knees, others clutching their bellies. The mighty river crosser is reduced to a muddy, sulking mess. The legend ends in slapstick, and honestly, that was the point. The river wasn't just an obstacle. It was a teacher, a prankster, a stage for comedy. Every attempt, whether with rocks, sticks, logs, stones, or vine-stock cavemen, something. But every fall, every splash, every slip reminded them not to take themselves too seriously. Survival was hard, but it didn't mean it couldn't also be hilarious. Sometimes the clan turned the whole ordeal into a ritual. They'd cross, then recross, then challenge each other to do it with style. Who could balance longest on the log? Who could swing farthest on the vine? Who could make it without falling once? Of course, the answer was usually nobody. But that didn't matter. The laughter, the cheering, the sense of togetherness, that was the real win. And here's the thing. Those clumsy comedic river crossings planted the seeds of progress. One day, logs lashed together would become rafts. Stacked stones would become bridges. Vines twisted tight would become ropes. The failures, the splashes, the pratfalls all were part of the learning curve that nudged humanity forward. Innovation, it turns out, was born out of both desperation and comedy. So when you imagine a caveman standing triumphantly on the far bank, then slipping face first into mud, don't just laugh, though you should. Hard. Remember that in that ridiculous moment lies the essence of humanity. Stubbornness, creativity, and the ability to turn disaster into progress. And into a really good story around the fire later. Crossing a river without a bridge wasn't neat. It wasn't graceful. But it was unforgettable. And in the Stone Age, unforgettable was the closest thing to glory.